right, we get going. Thank you very much for coming along this afternoon. Really excited to be here. My name is Nick Penston. I lead clouds engineering inside our cloud and platform engineering group inside Fidelity Investments. I'm here with my colleague Neil McGonigle, who's going to help out today. Neil is an engineering leader and an open source advocate in the same space. And over the next 30 minutes or so, we want to take you on a bit of a journey from when we started doing open source, small contributions, to where we are today, where it's really integrated into our engineering culture, in the DNA of how we do things when it comes to strategic contribution and ensuring that we're embedding this inside what we do every single day. And through that, we want to hit on a couple of key themes. The first is when it comes to scaling. Maybe you're already doing open source, but how do you scale it inside of maybe medium or large size organization? What are levers that you can pull to help you on the way? What have we used? What are the challenges we've met? What things have we done to overcome them? When it comes to measurement, key topic we've heard in plenty of conversations today, what have we used to drive? What KPIs, measurements have we used to help us on our journey? And finally, I'm really excited about the last piece. What are the small things that you can take away today to execute in your teams tomorrow to help you on your journey? All right, let's dive in. So first, a bit of context about where we started. Like many who are starting off in open source, we start off pretty small, starting doing small contributions into projects that interested us. And as we did that, we started to iterate, try to understand then what does open source mean inside our organization? What are the checks and balances we want to send those contributions through? We stood up an open source program office and began to iterate off that. And that became our springboard off into where we are today. And that's where we're going to focus on. We're going to focus on the latter part of that journey. If you're interested in the start of that journey, definitely myself and Neil will be around after. Happy to talk about that or reach out to us online. Again, happy to have the conversation there also. Okay, so you've got your open source contributions happening. You're really interested in scaling. You've got your buy-in. What next? So what we've done is really laid out kind of 5 key areas that were really helped us drive at scale from an enterprise perspective, things that really helped accelerate from that small beginning to where we are today, where it's really embedded in what we do. I'm going to step through each one of these, get into a bit more detail. So first up is our simplified strategy. So what do we call a simplified strategy? For us, a simplified strategy is a strategy that you can pitch within about 30-40 seconds. It's 1 or 2 visuals. Any persona or role inside your organization can understand it very clearly about what you're trying to achieve by reading that pitch or looking at that visual. And we've used this extensively through our small beginnings and into where we are today. So what does that look like in relation to an open source journey? So the diagram on the screen is one of the iterations of this simplified strategy. And you can see it's pretty simple. It's 6 boxes, essentially. And we use this all the time to communicate what we're doing. And we still use a version of this today in relation to articulating our journey. So let me walk through it, just give you an idea of how we are articulating this. So the first step is around enablement. That's about getting more people contributing to open source inside your organization, understanding what open source means to you as part of your organization, and we use what's called nano contributions to enable that. Nano contributions are those really small changes. Think document changes, think very small code changes. And this enables us to be able to engage with the community really, really quickly. And this is 2 actually really big areas that it addressed as part of this strategy. The first is from an engineer's perspective. It sets the tone in that to get involved in open source in our organization, you can start small. You don't have to be chasing those big features to get on the leaderboard in relation to doing open source. The second is it sets the expectation with your stakeholders and your leadership from a buy-in perspective. You're saying our journey starts with enablement. We're not going to be contributing massive changes into the ecosystem straight away. It's going to take us time. So once we've iterated over that, we moved into our expertise area. And this is about narrowing down the projects in which we are contributing to and building expertise in them. These projects tend to be areas we are interested in and being able to engage in a higher maturity in relation to the open source community. The final one is about impact. It's about building on top of the last two blocks, starting to engage with the community in a more impactful way, bringing that value back more and more into our organization, and being able to see that value then as part of the value stream of delivery inside the org. And when you think from enablement to impact, the complexity of those changes is also growing. So you have your strategy, you've been out there communicating, you got some buy-in. So how do you enable your developers now to follow that path? So when me and Neil were sitting down, we were thinking about this presentation, we said we wanted one slide here, and what would it be? And we landed on essentially this. So contribute to what you know. It seems pretty self-explanatory and obvious, but by contributing to projects in which you use as an organization has a big, big impact. One, with your engineers, because it really helps set the path. It says, these are the projects which are important to us, and by focusing on them can really drive meaning. You're using them every single day. From a leadership perspective, it's able to articulate that value of back to the organization because you are contributing to projects which you use every day. So you're an API team, maybe using frameworks in relation to open source, contribute to them. Maybe you're a platform team and you're using platforms in CNCF or CDF, for example, contribute to them. Again, it drives that sense of purpose and meaning both with your engineers and also your leadership. So what type of categories, when we think about setting that path for our engineers, we focus generally on four kind of key areas. Talked a little bit about nano contributions. And they're not just for enablement. Nano contributions add a lot of value in projects at any stage, and we continue to focus on them throughout the whole simplified area. When you think of bug fixes, think about the friction inside your organization and fix those, and that can, again, is easy to articulate that value. When it comes to features, capabilities that you want to utilize yourselves as part of your organization, they're kind of key things. And finally, when it comes to security, open source is inherently more secure because of all the eyes on that code. Be that extra pair of eyes. It's good for you and it's good for the community. But contributing and increasing your contributions doesn't help scale overall in large organizations. We found that two kind of key areas were critical to really bring it into the culture and embedding it into the engineering, and that's both from a social perspective and a technical perspective. And there's two key areas which have really been impactful for us in relation to these two pillars and helping us enabling that journey at scale. I'm going to talk about the two of those. Whoops. All right, the first is steering groups, and we've heard the term steering groups a couple of times today. So what is a steering group in this context for us? A steering group for us is a federated community, and we're decentralizing decision making while empowering everybody to drive that, but keeping alignment to the overall strategy. Steering groups have been the foundation for us for scale, and if we had one slide to come here today and present, it would be this one. It has been fundamentally core to how we've driven our whole open source movement, and we use this for many things, including driving engineering excellence, best practice standards, etc., as part of our engineering. So what does that look like? From a model perspective, we use a three-tier model in relation to this, and it's circular in nature. The first being the steering group at the very top. So think of a steering group as a set of individuals, technologists who are really passionate about open source. You're handing them the keys to the strategy. They are the owners and accountable for that simplified strategy, but also how that is implemented and getting into the complexity of execution. The focus group is actually how we scale. So a focus group is centered on a capability or a set of libraries. It could be set on a key set of platforms, and it's a group of individuals who only contribute to those areas. They build expertise, so think of the simplified model, that middle tier, and also drive impact. That's where they're landing. That's what we use the focus group to drive. And both these groups are accountable for driving the community across our organization when it comes to open source. So think about setting up events, getting more people involved, working with our open source program office for reducing friction when it comes to overall contribution when inside our organization. They again are the drivers to essentially the whole community while aligning to the ultimate strategy that we've set out. So what lessons have we learned about running successful steering groups? There's been a couple of kind of key ones. I'll call out two. The first is don't start with focus groups. Start with a single steering group. We had a single steering group for a considerable amount of time. It grew actually even quite large. What it allows you to understand what a model like this means in your organization. The steering group then helps drive your advocacy. It gets you to understand the context in which you want to work. We then spun up a single focus group to even understand what a focus group meant to us and how we were going to ultimately run these at scale when it came to, we wanted to drive autonomy, but have alignment to the overall strategy. And again, take your time, spin them up as needed, and also spin them down as needed. They're not always a long-living thing. The second one, which I think is even more important, is about transparency. So if you've ever worked in any federated model or decentralized model, understanding and keeping things aligned can be really, really difficult. For us, ensuring that you work out loud, so the concept of working out loud, putting stuff on your intranet, like the minutes of each of the meetings, when you think about how do I join these focus groups, how do I get involved, making sure that's very clear to every single person in your organization. That was another key aspect of keeping the alignment, both from an engineering perspective, but maybe for your leading initiatives like this in your organization, you're able to see that things are aligned or not without having to micromanage it. And finally, on the steering group side, what about challenges? Again, we've had a couple of interesting pivots as part of this journey. The first one is the model is actually quite flat in nature when it comes to the steering group and then the focus groups. What we did at the very beginning was our focus groups are very narrow in relation to what they were focused on, and then we ended up with a lot with overlapping concerns. And it started getting really confusing in relation to what was the responsibility of each one of those groups. So we started to think differently about the focus group. Now some groups are platform orientated, some are foundationally orientated, and actually some then are at that very small thing. So again, being flexible is really key in a model like this, but do what works for you. The second one, which is probably no surprise because we've heard it in many presentations today around open source, is time. Ensuring that the leaders involved in driving these focus groups and the steering groups have time to participate, but also time to lead, and ultimately gets integrated as part of the role. At the beginning, you might get away with that not being the case, but as you scale, particularly across a very large organization, ensuring that it's part of their day-to-day is critical to enable that scale. So I'm going to pass it over to, my computer loves this, I'm going to pass it over to Neil now, who's going to talk about an awesome concept called the Jam.
Thanks, Nick. Hey everyone. So the Jam, when you think about our open source initiative, was about getting engineers into the room together to learn about open source and to contribute to open source together in a group environment, very collaborative environment. And it allowed us to set the context around why this was important, and it allowed us to create entry points into open source for engineers. So when they said, how do I get involved in the initiative, we can say, come along to our next Jam, and everybody's going to be there, and you can ask questions and learn about the process. And the Jams are great because they apply regardless of the maturity of where you are on your initiative, whether you're at the beginning or whether you're more mature in your open source journey. Nick showed the 3 pillars of the strategy earlier. The beginning was nano contributions, and the idea was to build the enablement and allow people to do non-complex contributions just so they could understand the process to contribute to open source and they could learn a bit about it. So we started with Jams that were focused on nano contributions just to teach people the process, set the context. And as we evolved the Jams, we focused more on strategic contributions where you'd have pockets of engineers working on feature contributions, or we worked on particular projects, or we had teamed Jams as well. We might have an observability Jam where we focused on open telemetry project, for example, or security Jams where we looked at vulnerability. So it applies across the board. And what we found from the Jams as well is that we raised the overall engineering maturity bar because engineers were, talking, sharing ideas, talking about code, and just having that group environment was a real big success for us when we thought about the Jams. We started the Jams at the tail end of the pandemic, that awesome time when everyone worked from kitchens and bedrooms for a while. But we moved into a combination then of hybrid, where we had some people back in the office and some people remote. And that kind of remote hybrid model was quite flexible because people could dial in, we could do screen shares and walk people through the process about how to contribute, how it works in our company. And then we could also, do breakout rooms and guide people with challenges they had. And where we evolved to now is because we have kind of dedicated time in the office, we've tried to, time the jams when we're all in the office and do them in person without a dial-in. And it's actually really accelerated the community building element of open source, which is really important. Developing that kind of camaraderie and association, and people getting to know people outside of their squads and outside of their backlog work through the open source initiative. So that's really been the most successful iteration of the jam so far, is the fully in person. Some of the lessons we learned on this whole journey with jams and with the initiative is the importance of having advocates. So technical leaders who understand why we're doing open source and can talk and articulate why is it important to the company, what are the benefits for the company, and then for the engineers, what are the benefits for the engineers. So having advocates is really important. I'd say the second learning on the jams was having a good blend of experienced open source contributors and newbies so that we could support each other in that. I'd say another learning was around asking for feedback. So after we ran a jam, we get feedback from the engineers. What worked well with this session? What were the challenges? Was this 90-minute session valuable? What would help more? And we continue to refine the jam process each time. And I'd say a final point then is around pre-work. So getting people to register for access or any kind of accounts they might need. Do all that in advance. And reach out to people who sign up for these jams in advance so that you can make sure they're on track and they have everything they need to kind of hit the ground running on the jam. Challenges with the jams, I would say, when you think about scaling the jam up, if you run these jams too frequently, it can actually be difficult for people to attend, it can hurt engagement, or if you run them too infrequently, it can hurt momentum as well. So they were two things to consider. I would say finding the time to do them. We're lucky enough that we have a dedicated learning day in Fidelity, so that was the natural kind of day to schedule these to kind of minimize the impact with squad work. But even if you don't have a learning day, finding a time that's kind of the most suitable, whether it's afternoons or mornings, that was a challenge as well to maximize the engagement. And then finally, the big challenge with the jams was around issues for new people to work on. People came with great intentions and then spent half the time looking for good first issues on projects that we know, looking through, trying to pick a suitable one to work. So we started to kind of preload the issues, scope them out in advance, list them and assign them to people prior to the jam so people could arrive in, have an issue, make the code change and actually focus then on the contribution process rather than trying to find an issue to make a change, because that was a big one. Measuring success. So measurement is obviously at the heart of everything we do. If we're not taking measurements, it's hard to know, are we moving in the right direction? Are we being successful? Measurement changes throughout the journey. At the beginning, we were looking at things like number of contributions, very basic. Are we trending upwards in contribution compared to last month? That kind of thing. After a while, we looked at number of contributors. There's no point in scaling up the contributions if it's just 2 people. We lose half the capacity if someone's gone. Okay, so that's, the metric changed towards community growth then. And as we evolved further, we looked at things like strategic versus non-strategic contributions. Non-strategic contributions are still good. Maybe they serve value for learning for the engineers, but strategic contributions are where we're looking at open source projects and contributions that have real value in the platforms we use. So understanding that was a measurement we moved to as well. So the point there is that it will change depending on where you are in the journey. One of the concepts we followed was the one metric that matters. If you're measuring a lot of different things and if a huge matrix of measurement, it's hard to know, well, what's the important one now? People are looking at all these stats thinking, well, where's the value here? So we tried to focus on one metric at a time. So maybe it was community growth at the beginning. It was all about growing the community. That's how we build capability and how we build a sustainable community. And you talk about that one metric and it kind of aligns then the behavior and the focus on what's important. And beyond that then, it can evolve into more specifics around, like I mentioned earlier, strategic versus non-strategic. Maybe that's where the focus is at a certain time. So, and that one metric can change quarterly, monthly, weekly, whatever is relevant to you, but it just keeps everybody aligned on thinking on what's important right now. Lead time, basically from the moment someone does a code commit for a contribution, how long does it take until that's merged externally? And understanding that and measuring that is really important, because if it takes too long, the change could be stale. And if it takes too long, even if the change goes in, it's a bad experience from an engineer standpoint as well. So keep an eye on your lead time. Similarly, drop rate is really important. Drop rate are the contributions we make that never actually make it through to the external project. They could be rejected internally as part of the process, or they could be rejected externally because maybe it took too long and they're stale, or maybe they're rejected internally for some other reason. But understanding drop rate, seeing which way it's trending, and understanding then is there patterns is really important to make sure we have a good experience with the engineers and we can refine the process as required. Engagement metrics versus strategic value metrics, both are important. At the beginning of your journey, you'll be all about engagement metrics, how many people are engaged with the initiative, are we growing the community, all that type of stuff. As you move on and mature, it'll be more about, well, what projects have we contributed to that are actually being used in strategic platforms. But don't focus on one without the other. If you focus only on the strategic one and take your eye off the health of the community, the internal open source community, you're going to hurt yourself in the long run, because you'll run out of people, or you have to keep your eye on the health of both. So balancing that depends on where you are in the journey, but it's important to consider both. I'm going to change gears now and talk about a few things that we learned that had a big impact that you can probably implement right now in your initiatives. The first is mirroring best practice. So we all know open source is a hotbed for innovation. You've got a lot of diverse ideas. There's also a lot more freedom, I think. People in open source projects aren't as restricted maybe as within financial organizations. So you see a lot of experimentation, and you see a lot of best practices evolve from the open source community. So we took a lot of learnings and took stuff back in. So that's really a great place to learn that. But also non-technical learnings. Even engaging with the special interest groups and the communities and looking at how they talk about their work, how they communicate, how they share ideas, how they work transparently. And we took some of those ideas back in as well, which was really beneficial for us. Recognition. I've heard a few people on talks today mention recognition. I completely can't underscore how important it is. We're depending on engineers to run workshops, run jams, make these strategic contributions. They're basically turning the wheels of open source, the open source initiative. So calling them out, recognizing them is super important. We have a badging for achievements in open source. So on our internal directory, you can look up and you can see people have an open source badge. We've got a few different types of open source badges. But for people then, that's very transparently acknowledging that this is an important initiative because, oh, there's an achievement badge for it. So people notice it then, but also the people who earn those badges recognize that they're doing something that's really recognized as valuable for the company as well. So recognition is super important. I would say as well, it's important to keep telling the story. So use whatever channels you have, whether it's newsletters, whether it's email, whether it's chats. Talk about the benefits of open source for the company in a language that people will understand, even if they're not involved. So give the context. So say things like, we've contributed to X open source project, we've used that contribution in our Y platform, and the benefit has been Z. So really, call it the successes and explain it to people. This isn't something you can just put in place and away you go and it'll run itself. You have to kind of keep promoting it, talking about it, and generating more input into the community as well. And actually, the more people we get involved in the community, the more engineers can relate open source to their own platform areas they work in, and can look for strategic opportunities where we might bring in some open source projects. So more people into the community as well is very helpful. This is an important one as well. We think about open source being something that coders contribute to, but it's very important. I mentioned advocates earlier. We have technical leaders who don't code day to day, like myself, but there's other opportunities to get involved in open source. There is non-code contributions, like you can contribute documentation, but there's always opportunities to get involved in the process, whether it's through articulating the value or helping to organize. I actually made several open source contributions just to understand our process properly. Small code changes, you wouldn't even need to be a coder, small bug fixes or library updates, but understanding the process gave me an understanding of the frustrations that the developers might have on the journey internally in actually making a contribution. And I think it also gave me credibility as a technical leader when I'm trying to promote this, that I've actually done it and can empathize with the experience. So look for opportunities to get involved, even if you don't code day to day, because there is lots of different ways you can help move things along. I would say as well, integrating this into your learning plans is really important. We're lucky enough, I mentioned already, we have a learning day in Fidelity that's a dedicated time away from backlog work. So it was the natural day to look at running events that would promote open source. But even if you don't have a day, everyone in this industry is constantly learning, or they should be, because things move quite quickly. So bake it into whatever your learning track or learning time is, to have time away from your backlog or squad work into open source projects, see what's happening out there, what are other similar companies doing in the open source space. It'll give you ideas and fresh perspectives that you can bring back and drive discussions internally in your own company as well. That's it. So thanks very much for your attendance, and feel free to connect with myself or Nick on LinkedIn. And I think we have time for a few questions.
Any questions? Yes, sir.
Maybe two parts of the same question. How do you convince your organization to make room for this strategy? And how do you then also time box it so that people don't run away with it because the open source stuff's more fun than their actual day job, and that's all they want to do then?
Yeah, that's a great question. And that's the bit I alluded to at the very beginning that we didn't talk about, was that very start where we did things very small. It was very incremental. Finding the leaders in our organization that really support and advocate for what we're doing, being able to articulate that value, and really trying to understand how to do that in your organization. I think every organization has a different personality, and being able to adjust that. And that took a considerable amount of time. Probably took about at least 12, maybe 15 months for us to take on that journey, and then we really pushed it hard. But it was all about articulating the value and keeping it, getting the leaders on board to be able to show the value, and so on and so forth. I think to the second part here is the runaway. It's always a challenge. I think we haven't necessarily solved that. People really love doing this, and that's awesome. And that's where what we started to do is, it has to become part of what you do day to day inside your backlogs. And when you think of your maturity curve, there's a time where you can do that, but there's a time when you cannot. So I want to make a change in the open source community. I want to be able to push that in, and I want to be able to use it. No different than if it's a repo in my internal. Oh, that's the experience I want. And we had to wait till we kind of felt we were there, till we started putting it in our backlog, in our sprints, from perspective where when we have teams contributing to these open source projects, which they use, it took time to be able to get there. We still haven't solved that. People do love doing this stuff, and you have to kind of sometimes obviously coach them back off the ledge.
It's great for attracting talent though. And when people realize you're a financial company or a fintech and you're invested in open source, and they recognize that you're open to people working away from just your stuff. And for engineers, it's a huge motivator that they'll have that opportunity. So it's been great from that standpoint as well.
Awesome. Any other questions?
How frequent are your, what you say, called learning days?
Every week.
Every week.
I just had a question about steering groups. So I've experienced, I think a lot of people have the experience of steering groups, that sometimes they can be sort of very big on discussion and bureaucracy, but not very big on actual actions and results. And you can end up sort of steering groups, and the main thing that they're producing is kind of reams and reams of minutes and not very much else. I just wondered if you had any, how do you structure your groups? Is there anything that you found that has helped to kind of have a bias towards actually doing things in action rather than just a lot of discussion?
Yeah, and we'll give two perspectives here, right? So I'll give you mine, and then Neil will actually probably tell you the real perspective. So from my perspective, it's about, we actually plan out what we want to achieve as part of the open source, and then that goes to Neil. And then Neil has to drive that plan as part of the group. So it's not open freeness in relation to what we want to do. We want to be able to say, look, where do we want to be? What's the postcard back to ourselves in 3 months' time, 6 months' time? What's the line in the sand we want to draw? And then hand out to the steering group, which Neil chairs, and then be able to kind of build the strategy. And every month they're coming into like senior meeting staffs and they're recalling what they're doing. So there's a level of transparency and accountability. So at least that's from my perspective.
Yeah, no, it is. And we try not to have a talking shop. You know, the idea is we're coming in to achieve specific goals. We have anyone who's there in the steering group there is there for a reason. They're not just there to ride along. So we've limited numbers as well. We try and have people who are key from different platforms or focus groups, and they can come and talk about any challenges they have or where they are in their progress. And then at the steering group level, we'll push certain things that apply across the board to everybody. So it's very much on point. It's never a case of, oh, it's that meeting again and what are we going to talk about? And that's on me to put the agenda up in advance in a very transparent way and share it and say, if there's something else you want to talk to, pop it on there, and we'll be kind of, you know, boom, 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 very on point. So I think that people appreciate that as well. They're going to achieve particular conversation or get an answer on something specific, so it adds value to the time they're invested in the meeting.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we're on time with maybe one last question if you've anything else. All right, appreciate it. Thanks for coming along. Enjoy the rest of it.
Thank you.